Welcome to the Hub's ongoing election coverage. My name is Harrison Lohman, managing editor of the Hub, and today we're going to be talking about Caretaker Convention. Bear with me. We'll get to the specifics of that, but first, an introduction. Mark Carney is our prime minister during this election, but he's also leader of the partisan Liberal Party, seeking our votes. Polls appear to show that every time he dons the PM cape, makes a forceful announcement about the country and the trade war, he's able to potentially improve his party's chances on election day. Some might even say the party is intentionally having him don this cape as much as he can. And it's a cape that none of the other parties can don, those competing for power with him. As my podcast co-host Peter Menzies, former news executive and journalist, recently wrote, Carney isn't just auditioning for the role of prime minister during this election, he's also taking every opportunity to star in it. They point to the fact that he's never been elected by the Canadian electorate, simply by Liberal Party members. Still, others insist that he has every right to be donning this PM cape, that we are in an unprecedented trade war where the country's independence is even being threatened. They say this is an emergency that requires decisive action from the executive so that Canadians' interests can be protected. Guiding all this, as I've said, is something called the Caretaker Convention, and it's the reason why our guest, Philippe Lagassé from Carleton University, he's an associate professor there, specializing in the Canadian government and the Westminster system. It's why he joins us today. Philippe, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Harrison.
So let's figure out how this works. First of all, for the lay audience, Philippe, what is Caretaker Convention?
I think it's important to recognize that it's a series of rules. It's not one single rule, which is part of the reason that we run into trouble with it. We call it a convention, but it really is a series of different things. And this is where we need to clarify it. So on the one hand, what it really part of it deals with whether or not the government, which is always in place, I should add, is able to use government resources for partisan purposes and things of that nature. That's disallowed or that's clarified in the convention. But then there's another piece to this, which is that when a government either loses the confidence of the House of Commons or when Parliament is dissolved, which is what we have today, there is no legislature to hold it to account. And therefore, what we demand of the government is what's called the principle of restraint. So it's not that they can't exercise legal authority. It's not that they don't have legal authority. It's not that they cease to be the government. They're always the government. What we ask of them, though, is that they restrain themselves. And that involves a number of things that we can maybe discuss.
That's what I was going to say. How do you define restraint? How does the convention or conventions basically capture this idea of restraint? What's the definition look like?
So the idea is you shouldn't do anything that is not routine or that couldn't be easily reversed by a future government. So the basic principle is that if you can avoid doing things, you should probably avoid doing them. But there's a number of caveats that are put in place in the guidelines that are important for us to appreciate. The first one is the government retains the ability to act in matters that it deems urgent and in the public interest. As well, it can act in ways that may be irreversible, but should do so only when consulting with opposition parties. So if there's something really urgent that you need to act on and you need to do, and the other opposition parties are kind of on, or the opposition parties are on board, you can get away with it as long as you consult them. But the key thing for our purposes is really this notion of the public interest. The guidelines have been updated a number of times, almost with each election. And in this most recent update, we've seen language introduced about the importance of kind of acting globally. And it's perhaps not a mistake or odd for us to see that this coincides with the tariff threat from the President of the United States.
Let's clarify that, because again, I mentioned Peter Menzies off the top. He wrote on his Substack, kind of drawing suspicion towards the tweaks that were made to the convention in the days around the election, adding phrases like, the PM needs to be able to respond to evolving circumstances on the international stage. You're saying this is standard practice, that this, it's updated quite frequently to respond to the times.
Right, which is why I would hesitate to call it a full-fledged constitutional convention, precisely because it really is just a creature of the Privy Council office right now, so the Prime Minister's department, effectively. So they get to set their own rules, which is a bit odd, right? the executive kind of determining what it thinks the prime minister should or should not be able to do during an election. But that's the status now. We've never really asked Parliament to weigh in on this with any vigor, and we haven't had any kind of case law that defines it. But to your point, it gets updated almost every election, I would say, from what I remember. And we've seen updates with respect to COVID, for example, how that would be handled. And there was language put in there with respect to signing of international treaties at one point because the CTPP had to be signed during an election period. So the rules are kind of adjusted to the circumstances.
Yeah, so let's get across that. So I think it was in 2015, Harper was negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the 2015 election. That was probably because, we're not going to ask the rest of the world to wait as we, figure out, where we stand in those negotiations. In 2015, Trudeau is still responding to, what would that have been? 2021, Trudeau is still responding to the COVID pandemic. So he's having to act as PM during that. You mentioned consulting with other parties. Within the convention, it nudges the PM towards, okay, you should talk to the other guys before you make decisions. Do you know at all if that's been going on? Has Carney been talking to Polyev Singh potentially before, coming out in front of the PM podium to make a decision?
I'm not aware of it, but we can see kind of hints of it, or at least they take it for granted in a way. So when the prime minister is announcing that, Canada is going to retaliate or that there's going to be a call between the next prime minister and the president after the election, you seem to get a sense that, none of the opposition parties disagree with that, so he can move ahead with it. If there's either a tacit agreement amongst the parties, and if there wasn't, right, if one of the opposition parties was really of a different view, they would probably make that known, and it would force the PM, I think, to have more caution around some of this. But that being said, we're not really privy to any information or discussions that the parties are having.
Let's talk about some folks where there is some disagreement. So the Globe and Mail comes out the other day with an editorial where they say Mark Carney's expansive use of the prime minister's mantle in this campaign is problematic. Do you think it's problematic, Philippe?
It's a difficult one for me, to be honest, because these are fairly unique circumstances. And it's always been a bit frustrating for somebody who works on this stuff because in previous elections, when you write about it, you kind of point to the fact that this convention exists, but it also has these caveats for these exceptional circumstances. So part of the problem is that it's very much in the eye of the beholder, right? Is it in the public interest for the prime minister to deal with the president of the United States, to have a call with him? I mean, you can kind of make that case. Should he be calling the Secretary General of NATO? Well, if you take an expansive view of what's in the public interest or international affairs, I suppose you could fit it in within that. We also have the Ontario precedent, where just a couple months ago, the premier basically said, "Look, I'm premier, and I'm going to be premier all throughout this election,
Including in DC.
Yeah, and doing these things." So the circumstances have kind of demonstrated kind of the fragility, I would say, of this, and it really does reinforce to me, and this is a point that needs to be made. Um, these rules and this restraint ultimately depend on the judgment of the prime minister. And like a lot of the political rules of our constitution, we then depend on the electorate in this case to punish a prime minister that acts inappropriately. The problem, as you highlighted, though, is this seems to be helping the prime minister with the electorate, right? This is what they're looking for, and it's a bit what was helping forward with it as well. So, I think this is highlighting the limits of this rule, or at least, what we expect of it. And others have commented, I think of Ian Brody, former chief of staff to Prime Minister Harper, who kind of makes the argument that, look, this whole thing is a mirage. It's not real, caretaker. So it's hard to say
it's
if
like,
it's
yeah,
appropriate.
I know. I think for some of them, honestly, we see this with Ford and maybe Carney too. It's kind of like a steroid for the campaign. You get to appear in front of the podium with the beautifully carved maple leaf and look prime ministerial. I want to point out this disconnect. So, You wrote recently the PM and cabinet should not use government resources to advance partisan agendas or help them win re-election. And yet I'm listening to Cursive Politics the other day, a podcast of political strategists who were talking at length about this. And they said, we've been saying Carney should be PM as many days of the week as he can. These are better campaign days for him than making announcements. It's clearly helping him win this election or improving his chances. And he seems to know it's helping him win. No, I know you're a political scientist, but this is the general vibe that I guess some members of the public are getting.
Yeah, well, I think the key point to make here, and it's one that I find really frustrating, is it's the media who insists that there's somehow a difference between Carney as the liberal leader and Carney as the prime minister. The reality is he's always prime minister. So this
He's not
idea that he's
taking on one cape and
pausing.
putting on another. He's
No,
wearing both at the
no,
same
it's
time.
not. He's not changing capes.
Yeah.
He's like Superman. It's underneath. It's always underneath, right? Like that's the. It's not like it's not two hats. It's a uniform that he's got underneath, and he gets into the phone booth and then he switches it up, but it's always there, right? And I think this is the frustrating thing as a student of the executive in Canada. For me, that's the really difficult thing is hearing people say, "Oh, well, he paused his campaign or decided to become prime minister for a while." And it's like, what? He's always prime minister. So, to the curse of politics and the others that are making this point, he's basically using the incumbency advantage to its maximum effect. There's nothing in the caretaker guidelines that makes this clear distinction between the partisan role of the prime minister and the prime ministerial office. And it's not one that we recognize outside of elections either. I mean, the prime minister is always a liberal leader, during either an election or prior to the election. Similarly, Mr. Harper was always leader of the Conservative Party and prime minister when he was prime minister, whether in the election or out. So part of what we're running into here is just this odd insistence that we have kind of grafted onto our political system during elections that somehow it's more fair maybe to not recognize who holds the office. But I just ask, you know, your listeners and your viewers to imagine a situation in the United States where do we ever refer to a sitting president as the leader of the Democratic Party or the leader of the Republican Party when they're running for re-election? No, they're the president.
Mm.
We just that's what they are. I mean,
I
nobody
yeah.
denies that.
I think it's because during elections you want things to be fair, you want a level playing field, and there's obviously, I don't know, what do we call it, a home ice advantage or some sort of advantage when you're the PM. Like the Globe points to, he's taken up prime ministerial duties on something like 35% of the campaign days. So I guess that's, I don't know, the average person's views might change as it relates to it being specifically an election and fairness and, you know, what tools you have at your disposal and what tools you don't have. I guess that would be the pushback.
Yeah. And look, I'm not saying it couldn't evolve to that, right? I think that's the key point. We may get there, right? We may get to a point where we want the caretaker guidelines to be clearer on this. And we say, no, when it comes to certain activities, like we are making a distinction between the prime minister in their official executive capacity and that person as the leader of a political party running for re-election. Like we may eventually kind of introduce language to that effect and try and craft it more effectively around that. The challenge I have is that that's not what it currently says, and it's not what our Constitution currently demands, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing a clash between public expectations and constitutional reality, and you and I have talked about this in many other formats recently, right? Same with a prime minister who doesn't sit in parliament. That's another kind of clash, right,
Mm-hmm.
between the constitutional reality of the thing and public expectations around it. Eventually, the Constitution will catch up with public expectations. We're just not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's a convention, not a law. Like this is, I think people need to realize that too, right? That it's not. This is sort of a fluid sort of convention that's tweaked here and there, as opposed to something written in stone. I will say the public I don't know how they'd feel about. Apparently, Carney took a call with the German chancellor to discuss. The printout talks about how they discussed the success of the Hanover Trade Show. I'm wondering if there are certain things where you yourself as a an academic that's looked over this stuff, where you say, okay, clearly this does not fall within the caretaker convention. The PM must address this urgently, emergency level stuff. Like, is it fair to say that sort of thing doesn't fall within caretaker convention?
Yeah, I think it's like there's a number of things where you'll say, for instance, what social media account are you using to say what? Is what you're doing really in the public interest? Should you not exercise greater restraint here? Um, and really, what I hope comes out of this, right, is we need conversations like this so that after the election, we're able to maybe have a better discussion about what the rules should say. And here, this is where I've encouraged in a number of places, Parliament needs to kind of get its act together and start holding hearings about this and start trying to contribute to these rules. If there were a separate set, or at least a complementary set of guidelines issued by Parliament about what it thinks the rules are, or if there was at least some conversation happening between the PCO and the Parliament to say, look, what do we think are general principles that we can agree with around you know, what offices should be held by who in what circumstance during an election? I think that would help a lot because right now I wouldn't even elevate this to a true constitutional convention. This
Mm,
principle of restraint, I would say, is a practice. It's something we're trying out. We're still trying to figure out exactly what the contours of it are. We're still trying to land on exactly, what we think is permissible or not. And as a result of that, you can have both premiers and prime ministers that push the envelope and maybe take it too far, right? And it's incumbent upon us and our representatives in the parliament to push back on it and say, no, you know what? Going forward, we want this to be more contained. And when people say, well, would that ever happen? It did. In the aftermath of the 93 election, there were hearings on what Kim Campbell did around
mm.
Pearson Airport, precisely within the context of caretaker. So we
What
have had
happened there?
this
What did she
before.
do?
Well, she signed a contract that she shouldn't have signed during an election period, and there were hearings about it after, right? And we had a discussion around whether or not that was appropriate. And
Mm,
that's really when we started kind of gelling and solidifying this thing a little bit more clearly, at least within the executive. But we need to have conversations like that after the election, right? To say, okay, how do people perform here? And are we comfortable with what was done?
mhm.
That's the right avenue so that, parliamentarians get involved in defining these rules.
Um, and you mentioned sort of eye of the beholder. You talk about going too far. I'm thinking often when I think about caretaker convention, like who's the final arbiter here? Would there ever be an instance where the Privy Council office would step up to a prime minister and say, "Sorry, Prime Minister, you can't be doing that according to X, Y, Z," or does the prime minister have final say in terms of what he or she gets to do in front of that prime ministerial podium during an election?
We don't know exactly what the conversations are. I would hope that the clerk has intervened in some cases and maybe had a word with the prime minister. That said, the Privy Council office isn't exactly known for its propensity to stand in the way of prime ministers,
Mm,
right? It's the prime minister's department. It's there to enable the prime minister. So we're kind of
not
asking them a bit
disable.
of an
Yeah.
right. It's not there to like disempower the political executive. It's there to enable it. So you may have conversations to that effect. You may have, fearless advice or at least something saying, look, Prime Minister, this is kind of off board. You shouldn't do that. But at the end of the day, the problem is that the decision ultimately lies with the PM. It's the PM that decides what they think is appropriate within the confines of the rules, which is why it's hard for me to say this is above board or not, because like, who am I to judge? That's the other problem. I'm just, some egghead who kind of reads books about this. I can have views on it, but it's hard for me to say one way or the other.
We need you
And
beside that podium, Philippe, to basically get
yeah,
the final say.
and,
They need
and
to
in the
be consulting with
past,
academics. Come on.
yeah. And some people have pointed out, one of your contributors, for example, Howard Anglin, has pointed out that in the past, the GG would have gotten involved, right? So we have a famous case of Tupper who tried to, appoint a bunch of people to the Senate on his way out when he basically was no longer going to be PM. And there's an instance where the governor general basically stood in the way and said, not happening. And that's kind of like a proto caretaker thing that we had.
Mhm.
The challenge that we have now is that the governor general really has lost a lot of that function as government has grown, and it's the role of that office is kind of shrinked. So we shouldn't expect a vice regal representative to get involved either. So it's a tough one that requires other political actors, again, namely Parliament and others, to say, look, we think the rules should go more in this direction, and we would nudge the Privy Council office towards a tighter set of rules.
Okay, final two questions here. We're talking about the civil service. Who's to say, why can't a senior civil servant, a deputy minister, or someone, uh, make these announcements, make these moves, and handle things well? We leave politicians to go out on the hustings and try and seek our vote. They can play in partisan waters, and we have a clean line of separation between those two things. Why does that not happen?
Number one, constitutionally, ministers are always responsible. That's kind of the core thing that we have in our system, right? You always have to have a responsible minister to do things. They have both constitutional and legal obligations and accountabilities and responsibilities. And you could presumably in some cases have, the clerk or the deputies fulfill that function, but that's just not been the Canadian way. We could get there, I suppose. Again, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. But I did have one comment about this when it came to the call that occurred between the Prime Minister and President Trump in the aftermath of a lot of what's been going on. And I don't think it would be wise, for instance, to place a functionary in front of somebody like President Trump. Right?
Yes,
That's
yes.
probably not your best move, right? When you're dealing with an adversary or an interlocutor who's looking for weakness, right? Are you going to put somebody in front of them who, is not of their standing? If anything, that's going to kind of fulfill or reinforce their sense that we're in a vulnerable position. And
Yes, we'll
so
be called
there's
less than governor.
particularly,
Yep.
yeah, so you have to be mindful of that, right? I mean, when you're dealing with a president who gets upset if somebody doesn't wear a suit in the Oval Office, I don't know if you want to send him a deputy minister to speak to,
Mm.
right? You have to be mindful of these things. Statecraft is a little bit complicated in that sense. So we may get there. Again, we may say, you know what, there's certain things that should be done at the officials level. The problem is there's a number of roles where it would be somewhat inappropriate for an official to speak with an elected representative. See what I mean? So that demands that in many cases we have the prime minister or ministers fulfilling that function. And that's reinforced by the fact that the Constitution and a number of our laws kind of expect them to do that.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you so much for taking us through this and getting into the weeds on this interesting topic. That's the Caretaker Convention, explained to us by Philippe Lagassé. He's a associate professor at Carleton University, specializing in Canadian government and the Westminster system. Thanks so much for joining us again, Philippe.
Thanks very much.